Hey everybody, hope everyone is enjoying Memorial Weekend. Today I wanted to get on and make a quick video about crypto miners and why I personally believe this is setting up to be the greatest trade of the summer. So, for those completely unfamiliar with the trigger system, allow me to quickly give a little introduction. The triggers are acceleration levels. We have the daily trigger, which is this light blue line right here. We have the weekly trigger, which is more of the aqua color, and we have the monthly trigger, which is this purple line down here. The higher the time frame, the stronger the trigger is. And then this shaded area represents the strength of the trigger, meaning if it will act as support or resistance. You can see here when price came down and dipped into the weekly trigger strength, which is shown by this shaded region, it bounced and moved back above. And you can see once it broke, it rejected the daily trigger a bunch of times, and then once it broke above the daily trigger, sharp acceleration to the upside. And then you can also see once the daily trigger strength turned positive, when it's above the line, you could see price bouncing off of the daily trigger strength. Bottom is velocity. As velocity increases, price is getting more and more bullish. Velocity decreasing is less and less bullish. So you can see Bitcoin here was struggling to break above its monthly trigger for a while, and then once it broke above its monthly trigger, it accelerated strongly to the upside, more than doubling in price at this point. And you can see that that's why the monthly trigger is such a strong acceleration level. And once the daily trigger and the weekly trigger cross above the monthly trigger, that puts the triggers in the all long orientation. And when the triggers are in their all long orientation, you'll see price move really well to the upside. To give a couple of examples of this, we'll jump to NVIDIA for a minute. So with NVIDIA, you can see something very similar. Price was trying to get above its monthly trigger for a while, and then finally breaks above its monthly trigger, is able to get its daily and weekly triggers to cross above its monthly trigger, puts the triggers in their bullish orientation all long, and then you can see price just exploding to the upside, dips down to the weekly trigger are bought. In the beginning, even just dips to the daily trigger are bought as price rides higher. And of course, NVIDIA has performed spectacularly well with its triggers in the most bullish orientation. You can take a look at Ethereum as well, and you'll see something very similar. Price trying to get above its monthly trigger. Over here, it got above a bit, but it couldn't get its weekly trigger to cross above, which is the confirmation of the breakout. Over here, it finally gets the weekly trigger to cross above, and sure enough, price explodes to the upside. Even when it dips, you could see really nice support at the weekly trigger, and now a continued push higher. And finally, we'll look at Solana as well, where you'll see the exact same story. Price breaks above the monthly trigger here, gets stuck for a bit, and then once it gets its weekly trigger above its monthly trigger, this crossover right here, which is the most bullish crossover, you can see price exploding to the upside, and when it dips, the weekly trigger catches support, and price moves higher. So in general, you're getting a sense that when the triggers are stacked bullishly, when the daily trigger is on top of the weekly trigger, on top of the monthly trigger, price tends to perform very well. We see the same thing here with SPY, struggling at the monthly trigger, gets its daily and weekly trigger above its monthly trigger, and even this dip bounced right off the monthly trigger and continued higher, and the same thing with QQQ. So we know now that this is the bullish weekly trigger, monthly trigger crossover. Price starts to explode to the upside. Dips are being bought at the weekly trigger or at the monthly strength, which is this purple shaded area right here. Another dip bought at the weekly trigger, and price continues higher. So now that we've got the introduction out of the way, where we can see that bullish stocks have their monthly trigger on bottom, followed by their weekly trigger, followed by their daily trigger. Let me explain why I think, why I believe that Bitcoin mining stocks are the best investment idea of the summer of 2024. So if we take a look at Mara here, you'll see that in the last Bitcoin halving, price broke above the monthly trigger here, had one rejection, pulled back to its weekly trigger, which held support, broke above the monthly trigger here, got the daily trigger to cross above, got the weekly trigger to cross above, and then price promptly exploded 1,500% to the upside. Huge move. And then eventually things calmed down and price broke below the monthly trigger, went through a strong period of downside. And here, price has now gotten back above the monthly trigger, got the daily trigger above, and got the weekly trigger above. And even these back tests of the monthly trigger held support, and now the triggers are stacked fully bullishly here with the daily trigger on top of the weekly trigger on top of the monthly trigger. Needless to say, Mara is looking like all those stocks I showed you before, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, QQQ, NVIDIA, SPY, right before they took off to the upside. And I think Mara is on the loading dock right here, ready to explode higher to the 50s, to the 80s, to the hundreds. The move, in my opinion, has not even started yet, but it does seem to be on the launch pad right here, ready for higher. And when we take a look at other miners, like CLSK, for example, you can see something very similar. Price broke above the monthly trigger, got the daily trigger above. Here's the weekly trigger cross, which led to this really nice upside. And now the triggers are stacked fully bullishly. Again, looks very similar to early NVIDIA days, early SPY before the eruption, early QQQ, early BTC. The move has not yet begun, but CLSK is building itself quite a very nice launch pad here. You can see Iron just recently has broke above its monthly trigger. Here, price broke above, but it couldn't get a daily trigger crossover. So, price break above the monthly trigger is not enough to set it on a bull run that lasts a year or two. We need to get the daily trigger and the weekly trigger above as well. So we had a couple of failed breakouts here, but this breakout is looking very solid. Within a couple of days, Iron can get a bullish daily trigger crossover, and within a month or so, Iron can get a bullish weekly trigger, monthly trigger crossover. And with the Mara and CLSK already in their most bullish trigger orientations, now we're starting to see other stocks like Iron starting to move into its most bullish trigger orientation, breaking above the monthly trigger and getting these bullish crossovers, which all point to a major move higher for all miners coming soon. If you take a look at Cypher, you see something very similar. Cypher's been trying to break above its monthly trigger for a very long time. As you can see here, rejection. Over here, it was a rejection. It couldn't get the daily or the weekly triggers above the monthly trigger. Rejection again. Over here, the daily trigger tried, but just fell short. Same thing here, tried, just fell short. Same thing here, rejection. And now Cypher, the fact that it just keeps pinning at the monthly trigger and the rest of the miners are looking really, really good, you would have to assume that Cypher is about to get that monthly breakout as well. So Cypher also looking ready to take off shortly. And then when we look at Riot, Riot is actually the least bullish in my opinion because the weekly trigger has crossed below the monthly trigger bearishly. So just wanted to say that as bullish as I am on miners, you could see here, it almost got the breakout, but the weekly trigger never crossed. Here, the weekly trigger failed this crossover, and here it also failed the crossover. And now with the weekly trigger back below the monthly trigger, Riot is the only miner stock where the monthly is strong bearish and the weekly is bearish. So just keep that in mind. And my sleeper pick for the cycle is actually Wolf. And the reason for this is because Wolf looks like it's getting ready to explode higher to the monthly trigger. It's in a very similar setup to here, where price pins at the weekly trigger for a while, the daily trigger comes down, and then price explodes back through the daily trigger, igniting that rally higher, where you could see that it rejected right into the negative monthly strength, which is this purple shaded area. But here, looks like it's doing the exact same thing. So this green, this aqua colored box is where I think price is right now. And I think the daily trigger is going to continue slightly moving down. Price is going to get pinned just like here between the weekly and the daily trigger. And then I think it's going to explode through the daily trigger and break up to this monthly trigger. Now, anything above the monthly trigger for Wolf can start a really strong and powerful squeeze, much higher to 10. Don't forget that back in the 2021 halving, Wolf exploded 1,000% to the upside upon breaking its monthly trigger. Well, from the lows, it was a little more than 1,000, but once it broke its monthly trigger, it still moved over 500% to the upside. So I think this is very similar spot to where Wolf is right now, right about here. I think it's about to make that strong move up to the monthly trigger, just like it did over here. And I think once that's complete and price can get to the monthly trigger, I think we'd see a major breakout above the monthly trigger. So I do like Wolf the best here, especially due to the fact that it's the most shorted miner. And if miners are going to make a spectacular summer move, which they look very primed to, thanks to Mara and CLSK, if you also look at the Valkyrie Bitcoin Miners ETF, you can see that although the monthly trigger has just appeared because it's a newer stock, the daily trigger is on top of the weekly trigger on top of the monthly trigger, which is very bullish for miners in general. Taking that all together, it seems like there's going to be a spectacular summer rally for miners. And for me, I like to choose the most shorted one because I believe that when all miners move higher and Wolf breaks above its monthly trigger, the short interest will trigger a very powerful squeeze higher. So that's my thesis on why I'm bullish on Bitcoin miners. Based on the trigger orientations for MARA, CLSK, WGMI, which is the ETF for miners, Cypher and Iron about to break above their monthly triggers. So you can see MARA and CLSK already above their monthly triggers, and their triggers all set up bullish, ready to launch on their launch pad. And now Cypher and Iron are heading to that same spot. So you would only assume that the rest of the miners are going to be following. When you also take a look at Bitcoin, you can see that it's clearly poised to break out much higher. The weekly trigger and the monthly trigger are going to continue acting as strong support. And once this level breaks to all-time highs, miners tend to vastly outperform spot Bitcoin and spot crypto on the final breakout above all-time highs if you look back to all previous cycles. So I do believe that once Bitcoin breaks out here above previous all-time highs, we're going to get the miners a move of a decade, in my opinion. A very, very, very strong push higher for miners. I think most miners will go 5 to 10x from where they are currently. So good luck. If this video was helpful, I would appreciate any likes on the video, as that would help spread it. Or if you want to share it with friends, family, that's also greatly appreciated. Hope everybody enjoys the rest of their Memorial Day weekend.